Most parents have high hopes for their children. Dr. Mary Willis did. She was taking her 4-year-old daughter to preschool classes. As she drove along, her stethoscope was laying in the back seat of the car. The little girl picked it up and she properly put it into her ears. And Dr. Willis was just thrilled. Oh, good, she thought. My daughter wants to follow in my footsteps and be a physician. And then the little girl picked up the chest piece and held it to her mouth. And she said, "Welcome to McDonald's. May I take your order?" Things don't always go as we plan them, do they? Our current sermon series on the Old Testament Book of Ruth tells us that. Last week we learned that Naomi and her husband, in order to escape a severe famine, had moved away from Israel to the nation of Moab to find a better life for their sons. And everything seemed to go well for a while. But after about a decade, her husband died, and then her 2 sons died, leaving her and her 2 daughters-in-law with nothing. Suddenly, all her hopes for a good life had been crushed. I found a few definitions of hope. Maybe one of these will resonate with you. Let's look at the first one. Hope is having your lottery ticket in one hand and your resignation letter in the other. Now, I hope that's not the definition that you identify with, because that's probably more foolishness than it is hope. This next definition is a better one. Hope is that little voice which tells you maybe when the whole world is shouting, "No way!" Now, that's the kind of hope we often need, isn't it? The hope that pushes us on to the next level. The hope that tells us there are no such things as barriers, and so we burst through our limits. Success begins with that kind of hope. Maybe you are in a season of life in which this next definition speaks to you. Hope is an acrostic which tells us, hold on. Pain ends. That's the hope that Naomi and Ruth needed. This morning we're going to be in Ruth chapter 2, and the theme of that chapter seems to be God's love brings us hope. You may wonder why this little 4-chapter book of Ruth is in the Bible in the first place. After all, she was just one obscure person among millions of people, and she wasn't even Jewish. The Old Testament was about God's relationship with the Jewish people, those people he chose as his own possession to work through in this world. But Ruth was not one of those people. Why is her story in this book? She was from Moab, a pagan nation, who were sometimes the enemies of Israel, and when they weren't, they were not on friendly terms with Israel. I think there are 2 reasons the book of Ruth was included by God in the Bible. The first is that Ruth eventually converted to Judaism. She married into a good Jewish family, and she became a matriarch in what became the most important family in Jewish history. She was the great-grandmother of David, King David, the godly king, King David, the greatest of Israel's kings. And therefore, she was an ancestor of Jesus. In fact, if you read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, you will find Ruth's name listed along with several great patriarchs. There's a second reason I think Ruth's story was included in the Bible, and that is because it serves as a parable of God's redeeming love for all of mankind. Hers is a story of hope. And hope is something we all need. Her story teaches us that God's love brings us hope. God's love brings us hope, first of all, through compassionate blessings that he pours out upon us. Let's begin to read Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing whose name was Boaz, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said, "Go ahead, my daughter." She entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. Let's leave that slide up for just a moment. Ruth and Naomi, after the death of Naomi's husband and her two sons, one of them Ruth's husband, after those men had passed away, they moved back to Israel, where Naomi was from, because she had nothing left to go to. And while there, they had to depend upon whatever they could find in order to survive. And so she went to the fields. It was harvest time. She was going to glean behind the reapers. And the text tells us, as it turned out, she was working in the field of Boaz. The Hebrew term for "as it turned out" literally means by chance happening. In other words, scriptures are saying perhaps this was merely a coincidence that she ended up in the field of Boaz. But I don't believe it was merely coincidental. Ruth and Naomi were in such dire straits that they needed more than lucky coincidence. Lefty Gomez is the person to whom this quote is attributed. "I'd rather be lucky than good." Several others have quoted him since that time and kind of adopted that as a philosophy of life. I'd rather be lucky than good. Lefty Gomez was a pitcher for the New York Yankees in the 1930s and the 40s, and he was good. He was an all-star 7 seasons in a row. He was eventually elected to the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. And yet Lefty Gomez believed that luck was more dependable upon him for his future than skill was. And I have to disagree with that. Let's take a little test to determine how valid that might be in our lives. If your life's outcome was dependent upon luck alone, would you be confident about your future? I think most of us would say no, because we understand that luck is whimsical. It comes and it goes. It's undependable. It's unpredictable. Luck is merely uncontrolled fate. And most of us do not feel very lucky, do we? You probably have thought, or maybe even said, something like this at one point in your life. It's always someone else who gets the accolades. It's never me. I'm never the lucky one. Or, my lottery numbers are never selected. It's always somebody else who has that luck. Or, a lot of terrible things seem to happen to me. I must be really unlucky. Some of you remember the TV variety show, Hee Haw. It was a music and comedy show set in the context of rural people. It ran in the 70s and 80s. One ongoing skit featured a group of hillbillies singing a sad sack chorus. Gloom, despair, and agony on me. You remember that song, right? The most prominent line in that little chorus said, if it weren't for bad luck, I'd have what?
No luck at all.
No luck at all. You know the song. And maybe you feel that way sometimes in your life. And so that idea of I'd rather be lucky than good doesn't work for you, because if it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. You don't want luck being the determining factor in your life. You have been at the mercy of fate, and it has not been kind to you. That's how Naomi and Ruth felt. Let's go back to chapter 1 again. We looked at it last week. And read verse 20. Naomi, upon arriving in Israel, coming back to her old friends after all those years gone by, has said, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitterness, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. She wasn't feeling lucky. She didn't want to depend upon lucky circumstance to guide her life's outcome. Here's a better motto for us to consider. Rather than the one that says, I'd rather be lucky than good. How about this? I'd rather be blessed than good. That is blessed by God. And that might be more desirable for us because we trust God. We know He is a God of great ability, while we do not always have the ability to affect the outcomes of our lives. And so we trust in Him. We trust His power to bless us. He is a very capable God. Isn't that what our salvation is based upon, after all? That we trust God's grace to save us more than we trust our ability to save ourselves? Isn't that why we pray to God? Because we trust in His ability when there are no other answers. We ask for His divine intervention to bring some resolution to a problem. We pray for His healing when the doctors have given up. We would rather be blessed than to be good. Because sometimes life is hopeless without God. God knew that Ruth's situation was hopeless. She and Naomi had returned to Israel, but at the wrong time. We see that in Ruth chapter 1, verse 22, which tells us that Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, what was wrong with that timing? To arrive at harvest time without having first planted is a hopeless situation. It's like the Pilgrims who arrived in the New World in November, long past planting time, and since they had not planted, there was nothing for them to reap. But by some great blessing of God, they found an abandoned Indian village. Apparently a disease had wiped that tribe out, and before they had died, they had hidden away a few baskets of corn and beans, and the Pilgrims found those, and they considered that God's provision for them. Because of what they found, they were able to survive the winter. God had granted them a great blessing. Ruth and Naomi needed a blessing like that when they arrived in Israel at harvest time, because otherwise theirs was a hopeless situation. Have you ever faced a hopeless situation? If you do, when you do, watch for the blessings of the compassionate God to come to you, because blessings will. We know that God will grant blessings, especially when we need them most, because we read that God of love in Ruth's story. So I don't think she ended up in Boaz's field by some stroke of dumb luck. I think it was the sovereignty of God at work, leading her to just the place where she needed to be, when she needed to be there. Proverbs 16:9 tells us this: the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. We may think we know the right path. We may plan it all out for ourselves, but God can see further ahead than we do. God knows what we do not know, and so it's best for us to trust His path for us when He reveals that. Only God can turn a bleak situation into hope. God's love does that. He brings hope into our lives through His compassionate blessings. Secondly, we find in His story that God's love brings hope through small acts of grace. We're not going to read the next few verses, but let me just summarize them quickly for you. Boaz arrived in this field to see how the harvest was going. He saw Ruth there, someone he did not recognize. He asked his harvest foreman who that woman was. She said, "Oh, that's Ruth the Moabite." the daughter-in-law of Naomi. She has been working hard all day to provide for her and her mother-in-law. And Boaz was so impressed by that he approached Ruth and struck up a conversation. Let's read that conversation in verses 8, 9, and 10. Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you." Next slide, please. "And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" God's grace is the product of his favor toward us. We read the word favor in that verse. In fact, that word is used 3 times in this chapter. It's the Old Testament concept of grace. It means something given to us that we do not deserve. Ruth hoped for a favor from some benefactor. She did not know God. She worshiped pagan idols. She did not know that God is the God of provision and that he would provide for our needs. And so she hoped for favor from some man who might take an interest in her. Boaz did and gave her special privileges. He told her, "You stay here in this field. Don't go somewhere else. I'll make sure you have all the grain you need if you stay and glean my fields. Work alongside my servant girls. My men won't bother you. And when you're thirsty, you go get a drink from the water jars that they brought for themselves." Why was he so kind to her? He was still recovering from several years of famine. He could ill afford another couple of mouths to provide for. But Boaz had a heart of compassion. God had given him a heart of compassion. But whatever Boaz could do for her, he knew was not enough. He knew she needed more. And so he prayed for that, as we read in verse 12, when he prayed, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He knew that there are some problems only God's grace can fix. He knew he was limited in his generosity to be able to provide all that she and Naomi needed. And so he prayed for that to the God of grace and favor. But Ruth knew she was undeserving of such favor. We read in verse 13 her response to this prayer. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls. You've been treating me like your servant," she said, "but you don't owe me anything. You don't even know who I am. And yet your kindness has been showered upon me. I pray that you would still find favor over me, and thank you for your help." But she knew she was undeserving. And don't we recognize that we are undeserving of God's favor? That's the reason we are saved by grace, this gift given that we have not earned for ourselves. God gives us the gift of salvation by his grace. But he also gives us small gifts throughout our life because of our grace. He pours out blessing after blessing because he is a gracious God. That's what we need. The God of love whom we read about in Ruth's story. If you have been the recipient of God's generosity, take a cue from Ruth and be humble. Be thankful. God's love brings us hope through his compassionate blessings, and God's love brings us hope through small acts of grace, and finally, God's love brings us hope through providential measures. Are you familiar with that term, providential? It's a theological term which describes one of the ways that God works in this world. Sometimes God works through miraculous means in which he supersedes the law of nature. Those are called supernatural acts. They cannot be explained by the laws of science. But other times God works through natural processes. Sometimes his working in that way cannot be identified because we think it's just the way that the world works. It's the ebb and flow of life in this natural world. But it's really God who is orchestrating through providential acts to bring his will to be for our lives. And he did that in Ruth's story. Let's read in verses 14 through 16 how he continued to work through Boaz's compassionate heart to meet the needs of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." There's a lot packed in there demonstrating Boaz's generosity and his human compassion, and we'll look at that one by one. First of all, maybe because there was some physical attraction going on, and there are hints of that in the Hebrew text. He invited her to lunch. "Come on over, have some bread and vinegar." Obviously, he wanted to make a good impression, right? Actually, that was a cultural delicacy, bread and vinegar. Sounds kind of gross to us. But it really was a cultural thing, and it was very appreciated. In fact, if you want to be a blessing to Dan, invite him over to your house for bread and vinegar. He'll just love it. Actually, that's not a foreign thought to us, is it? Because if you've ever been to a place like Olive Garden or Carrabba's, perhaps a waitress has brought you a small plate of balsamic vinegar mixed with olive oil, and it's been seasoned with herbs, and she brings you some ciabatta bread for you to dip in that mixture, and you eat it, and you think, wow, this is pretty good. That was what was going on. That was the meal that he invited her over. Come on over, have an appetizer. And then for the main course, you have all the roasted grain you want to eat. And then when it was over, the meal that is, Boaz continued to show graciousness and compassion through his willingness to be generous to her. And he told his harvesters this: allow her to harvest among the sheaves. The sheaves were the unharvested part of the grain, the field. The gleaners were not allowed to go there. They were to work behind the harvesters, and after the harvesters were filled with one or finished with one section of the field, then the gleaners could come in and pick up whatever was left over. But he told his harvesters, let Ruth come and work among the sheaves along with you. And then he said, and every once in a while, pull a stalk of grain out of your bundle and leave it where Ruth can find it. He was being exceptionally gracious to her. Maybe this is a little bit easier for us to appreciate if we fully understand the concept of gleaning. To glean means to gather what is left over by the reapers. It was the practice of the poor in ancient Israel. In fact, God made laws in the Mosaic law requiring access to the productive fields, crop-producing fields of farmers for those who were poor. God stipulated that if some of the grain fell while the harvest was going on, then the reapers, the harvesters, were not allowed to pick it up. They were to leave it there so that the gleaners, who had no fields of their own to harvest, could come along and have something for themselves. It was God's compassionate means of providing for the poor, the gleaners. When Holly and I served a small church in Connecticut before coming here to take this ministry, we were building our family. Our two youngest of our 4 children were born there. The church could not pay me a livable salary, so I often worked a part-time job as well as conducting the full-time ministry of that church. During those years, we learned to be very frugal. We ate a lot of fish and squirrel and venison that I could catch in the streams or hunt in the woods, and we gleaned in a commercial potato field near our house when the harvest was over. There were always a few potatoes left behind by the harvesting machines. Some of them were sliced open, others were too small to be picked up by the machines. But every once in a while, we would find a nice big whole potato. And we were able, through the gleaning process, to gather enough potatoes to last our family for a few months. I understand what Ruth was doing. It was survival. Survival. It would have been such a blessing if the foreman of the harvesters in that potato field in Connecticut had told the reapers, drop a few pounds of good potatoes in the fields where the Browns can find them because their family needs those. That's what Boaz told his harvesters to do for Ruth. And so verse 17 tells us that she was able to glean about 30 pounds of barley seed. That's not gleaning, folks. That is harvesting. That is a great haul. And Ruth brought it back and showed it to her mother-in-law, Naomi. God put it in the heart of Boaz to be gracious to this woman and her mother-in-law. It was God being gracious through him. That's the practice of providence. When you find God's favor, either directly from him or through some providential means, celebrate it. That's what Ruth and Naomi did. Let's read that in verses 19 and 20 of our text. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Now in that last line she speaks, we don't know whether the he who has not stopped showing kindness was a reference to God or to Boaz, but I think really it was true of both of them. And we see in Ruth's story that God's favor changed everything. Just a few days earlier, she had been crying out, gloom, despair, and agony on me. She said, call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life bitter. But now it was blessing this and blessing that. God's gracious providence turns bitterness to praise. You find the blessings of God in your life, even in times of misery. They are there. There was still misery in Naomi's life. Her husband was still dead. Her sons were still dead. She and her daughter-in-law had nothing to their name until this. A few new blessings came into their lives. And then it was as if everything had changed. In a recent counseling appointment, a lady commented to me that her life had not turned out the way she planned it. Due to unfortunate medical circumstances, she and her husband were not able to enjoy the golden years of retirement the way she envisioned they would. Then she remarked to me that God had given her other blessings to replace the ones she had lost. Wow. What an admirable outlook, right? We've all had that experience, haven't we? Of life not turning out the way we planned. Maybe due to some disastrous occurrence in our life. Naomi had that experience. She probably envisioned that her sons and daughters-in-law would provide them plenty of grandchildren for herself and her husband to enjoy, spoiling the rest of their lives. But instead, her family fell apart. It made her bitter, so that she could not count any blessings. Life appeared abysmal to her. And then suddenly a few unexpected blessings poured in, and her tone turned from bitterness to praise. How admirable it is when someone is able to look past the tragedies of life and find the blessings that God provides. It's been said, sometimes I just want someone to hold me and tell me, I know it's hard, but you're going to be okay. Here's some chocolate and $6 million. Okay, we may not get the chocolate or the $6 million, but God is always there to hold us and tell us it's okay. He is always there to grant us a blessing. You move on from your misery, just like Naomi did. We read of a different person in chapter 2 than the one we encountered in chapter 1. Do you want to be a different person than the one you are in your misery? Do you want to move on to the next chapter in your life, a happier one? Then focus your attention on the blessings of God. God loves us, and in his love, hope lives. Naomi and Ruth felt bitter, but God made them feel blessed. That's our God. And he has some Boaz waiting in your future. Someone or something to be the catalyst of the blessings that he's going to pour out on you. You hold on to your hope through your season of despair, and those blessings will come. The greatest blessing of all is ours. Let's go back to Ruth chapter 2, verse 20, and read the rest of it, the part that I did not include in the first reading. She added, that man Boaz is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. Kinsman redeemer. That also was included in the Mosaic law to help those who were in need. A kinsman redeemer provided a sort of salvation. It provided salvation for a family member who was in debt and could not pay that debt. A kinsman redeemer would step in and pay the debt and free that family member. Sometimes the practice of kinsman redeemer was applied to a widow who had just lost her husband. Maybe she hadn't had children yet, or maybe she had small children. And so a kinsman was urged to step in and marry her and raise the children in the deceased man's name and to provide for that family. It was an act of grace to help the helpless. It was a source of some salvation for those who were in need. That's why Naomi exclaimed, we have a redeemer. She was saying, we have hope. And that celebratory cheer is ours. For 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 18 and 19 tell us it is not with perishable things, such as silver and gold, that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ. We have a Redeemer. We have hope, and it is Jesus. He is your hope, always. He is your hope now. If you do not have the security of hope for the future, a better life, better days ahead, if you especially do not have hope of an eternity in heaven, then Jesus offers himself to you as that source of hope. He wants to be your Savior if you will commit yourself to him as your Lord. And if you've never done that, then we invite you to do that this morning. Begin experiencing the full love of God. Begin knowing what hope feels like. Let's stand and sing our invitation hymn.